Good afternoon, and welcome to our New York Archives Magazine online speaker series. I'm Josie Madison, editor of New York Archives. Today, we're joined by a number of notable guests for our program, A Mystery Solved at the State Archives, Paying for the Constitutional Convention of 1787. Dr. John P. Kaminski founded and directs the Center for the Study of the American Constitution in the History Department at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, where he's co-edited 35 volumes of the documentary history of the ratification of the Constitution, and has written, edited, or co-edited 30 other books on the Revolutionary era. Adam Levinson is a lawyer, lecturer, and founder of the free history website statutesandstories.com. He uses primary sources, including correspondence between the founding fathers and mothers, newspapers, and old laws to bring American history to life. Sergio Villavicencio is vice president for the Alexander Hamilton Awareness Society and project coordinator for the New York Council for History Education's New York City region. Among other service in the field of history, Sergio is also chair of the New York City Semi-Quincentennial Committee. Tom Ruller has been New York State Archivist since 2015. Tom is the author of several peer-reviewed journal articles and reviews on the use of technology in archives and the preservation of records in electronic form. There will be a question and answer session at the end of this presentation. And in the meantime, I am pleased to introduce our speakers.
Thank you very much, Josie, and welcome to everyone listening. Welcome to my colleagues here, Sergio, Adam, and John. Today's program is especially exciting to me. As archivists, we preserve documents. Many times those documents are used for one purpose or another, or often not used at all, until some historian, someone discovers the richness that they provide. Today's conversation is about some documents that on the surface may seem not all that interesting. They're financial records in many cases. But we learn so much from records that we preserve, and sometimes what we learn is not what we expect to find. So today, as an archivist, I want to just say thank you to all of you. You help make what we do much more worthwhile. So let's start into it. You found some new information on Alexander Hamilton with some fascinating implications. Where was this information and why was it not discovered by historians before now? I think you might want to bring up a PowerPoint to show some of this. Yes, I'll do that while you start to talk.
So it is our great pleasure and honor to work with everyone. And I encourage everybody to check out Professor Kaminski's background and Sergio's background with the AHA Society. So once we zoom in on this, this is a page of one single page from over 826 volumes of financial records, of journals, and of ledgers that you have preserved, and you can't really see much because it's the full page. But if you go to the next slide, you can see what we're going to focus on. And here, towards the bottom of that journal entry, and this is May 9th of 1787, you'll see that Alexander Hamilton and his co-delegate in Annapolis, and we'll talk about this later today, but they were reimbursed for attending the Annapolis Convention. And this we actually knew about, but this is the proof. So let's move, if we could, to the next slide. So Annapolis is no secret because we knew that Hamilton was paid because we have a copy of his letter seeking reimbursement. This page, however, is brand new information that came to light this summer, and I'll describe it this way. When you look at some of the Hamilton biographies, and the biography I'm going to mention is Brodus Mitchell, who wrote a 2-volume biography prior to the Chernow biography and prior to some of the more modern biographies. In a footnote, he points out that we do not know, that's a quote, we do not know if Hamilton was paid for attending the Constitutional Convention. And keep in mind, the Annapolis Convention was only a couple days, but the U.S. Constitution, the process of writing the U.S. Constitution in Philadelphia was from May, and they finally got a quorum May 25th, and that lasts until September 17th, which is Constitution Day. So we've known for many years that Virginia paid its delegate $6 a day. We've known that the state of Delaware paid 40 shilling per day. New Jersey paid $4 a day, but we did not know whether or not the state of New York paid its 3 delegates, who we will talk about today, to attend the Constitutional Convention. And this document I'm not sure if you're able to zoom in or not, but that number, 121, that's 121 pounds, which puts an exclamation mark that we now know. We've answered that question by Brodus Mitchell and other historians who could only speculate whether or not the delegates to the Constitutional Convention were paid. So I welcome the input of my colleagues on why, and in fact, I welcome the input from the New York Archivist, Mr. Ruller, whether or not and why it took so long to find it. But I think from my vantage point, one of the answers is that some of the records were fire damaged. There were so much of them, and it's 442 cubic feet of financial records and journals. And I think, as you mentioned, some people find this intimidating. They want to focus on other kinds of records, for example, correspondence. But as we'll get to later, sometimes you follow the money, and I'm an attorney, and that's what I do during the day. But there's value to that, doing a criminal prosecution or following a historical investigation. And that's what we did. We followed the money.
Here it is. And here's the evidence of the money. 121 pounds. That's not a small amount of money in 1787 or 1788 in this case, when it was actually finally paid out. I think there's another little story behind here. Look at the date that this was paid, May 19th, 1788. That's 6 or 7 months, I think, probably after the expenses were incurred. So the wheels of government grind slowly.
And Tom, I think they put your finger on another observation, which is that had people looked for it before, they would have potentially looked in 1787, because that's when the Constitutional Convention took place and they finished on Constitution Day, September 17th. But it turns out, to your point, that the New York delegates, and there were 3 of them, wound up giving a interest-free loan to the state of New York. And one of the items we're going to tease out, and we'll come back to this, I know there are some homeschoolers who are watching us. So one of the points is that there is a big question, not just because we didn't have the evidence for it, but whether or not New York would reimburse Hamilton, because the powers that be, and we're going to talk about George Clinton today, who was the governor of New York for over 20 years, was not in favor of what they did in Philadelphia. So we'll come back to that.
Well, actually, let's talk a little bit about George Clinton. But maybe before we go there are a couple other documents that I think you want to highlight here. Is that correct? Should I advance this a little bit?
Sure.
This might be one of the most important ones. This is the audit of those previous payments. Again, understanding financial records was important, right?
Exactly right. And to the credit of New York and how thorough they were back then, and you can see it's beautiful handwriting, but not only do we have the prior slide, which showed that Hamilton was paid, this is an audit that took place basically the same day. And if you're able to see it closely, and a lot of this information is now written about, in fact, we just posted, and we'll talk about it on the Statutes and Stories website, but it tells you the number of days, 76 days, and it tells you it's 32 shillings per day is what the reimbursement was. And it turns out that was less than the other states. And I'm using Delaware as an example, which paid 40 shilling per day. So you can see the total was 121 pounds and 12 shilling. So this is exciting because we now know how much Hamilton was paid. And we'll talk about later why it was important that he did get paid, because it was symbolic. And it's important to understand why some thought that he may not have been paid. But the next slide, I want to allow one of the other speakers to introduce it on why. And this is a brand new discovery that we are announcing today. But I'm wondering if one of my colleagues wants to take the baton on this very exciting slide.
Well, this is a document that indicates that toward the end of the convention, Robert Yates decided that it was time for him to return to the convention. Robert Yates and his colleague John Lansing both were displeased with the direction that the convention was taking. Consequently, they left in mid-July, supposedly never to return. They went first to New York City. They talked with Governor Clinton in New York City, explained to him what was going on, and saying that they didn't anticipate the convention would get back on the right track. And so they left, and they didn't anticipate returning. And so that's what most historians, all historians really, understand. And they have written in that context. But in this particular document, what we see is that Yates had decided to return to the Constitutional Convention in mid-September. Presumably, he decided to return because he saw that Hamilton had returned. And you have to try to determine what was the motivating factor that convinced Robert Yates that he should return to the Constitutional Convention. He made it down from Albany to New York City. Unfortunately for him and future anti-federalists, when he got to New York City, he found that the Constitutional Convention had adjourned the previous day. And so instead of going on to Philadelphia, Yates went back to Albany and submitted a request for payment for his travels from Albany to New York City, and then the return trip from New York to Albany. So this document here, this financial document, seemingly rather obscure and incidental, really opens up a brand new interpretation as to Hamilton's motivation in the Constitutional Convention and the response to that action of Hamilton by Yates and perhaps even Governor Clinton.
Professor, if I could put an exclamation mark on it, I think people are very familiar with the most famous in American history, Ride on a Horse. And this is Paul Revere in April of 1775. And of course, Paul Revere is coming to warn folks that the British are coming. The British are coming. So I want people to imagine there's a similar event. And this is on September 17th. September 17th is the day that, and we're going to see a picture of it, when the delegates line up to sign the Constitution. And we're going to talk about how Hamilton was the only delegate from New York. And it was unanimous that all of the states were approving the Constitution at the convention for it to go to Congress and for Congress to distribute it to the states for ratification. So we're going to talk about why that was important, that it was the message of the Federalists was that, this is easy. Washington supports it and Franklin supports it and all the demagogues, these delegates who are meeting in Philadelphia, they support it. It's unanimous. This is what we have to do. But Yates did not agree with this. And there were others, and a lot of us know who they were. There were anti-federalists, and that would be the name that they would be called later. But Yates is on the way to Philadelphia because he doesn't want this to be unanimous. And we did not know this until we found this slide. And it is fascinating. And it almost rewrites this, and it's going to start the process of telling the behind the scenes story of what was happening as the delegates are rushing to get the Constitution sent to the Congress and to New York, which is where Congress met at the time. There was this drama taking place behind the scenes.
Sergio.
The unanimity factor was extremely important. And that's why when they made the list of all the people who signed the Constitution, they did not list them individually, but they actually listed them by delegation. In that order, the delegation seemed to be completely unanimously approving of endorsing the Constitution. It didn't look like there was a delegation that did not sign the Constitution. However, why this new document is so important is because if Yates actually made it in time back to the Constitutional Convention before everything was signed, he would have now be the second person in the delegation for New York and probably would have attempted to prevent Alexander Hamilton from signing. Alexander Hamilton signed as in a personal capacity at first sight, but with the presence of Yates, it would have meant that the delegation, with the two minimum delegates that were required to be present to be a delegation, would have been formed again and completely divided in the middle. Then would Hamilton have signed it anyways? That's a very interesting question because you were to sign it by delegation, not as individuals, and that would have changed if the delegation was completely divided.
That is probably one of the most important points that's coming out in all of this. And I want to kind of go back to the Alexander Hamilton's perspective on the Federalist system versus George Clinton's perspective, which would have also been supported by Robert Yates. So Hamilton, we've just talked about, was one of 3 delegates to the convention in Philadelphia. His relationship with New York Governor George Clinton was very long and very complicated. Can you talk a little bit about the relationship of Hamilton and Clinton? Because I think that's important context to understand why the New York delegation might have been divided had Yates managed to get to Philadelphia in time.
Hamilton and Clinton were close friends, colleagues throughout the war years. Clinton was 16 years older than Hamilton was. And so there was a sort of a mentor relationship. In fact, toward the end of the war, Hamilton wrote a letter to Clinton advocating that Clinton stand out and communicate with leaders throughout the country, advising and hoping that these leaders would not leave government, but stay in government after the war to help assist the new country. Hamilton said that he was not of sufficient stature to be addressing these people throughout the country, but that George Clinton was. And so they worked together very closely. Hamilton, as the aide to Washington, General Washington, recommended George Clinton to be named in charge of the erection of forts at the highlands of the Hudson. He also recommended that Clinton be appointed a brigadier general in the Continental Army. Clinton had been, before that, brigadier general in the state militia. So they were very close. And in fact, when Hamilton was sick at one time, Clinton brought him into his home and nursed him back to health. But things started to change in 1780 when Hamilton married Philip Schuyler's daughter. Schuyler was a political opponent of George Clinton. In fact, they ran against each other for the governorship, first governorship in 1777, in which Clinton won. And that was repeated in 1780 and 1783, where George Clinton defeated Philip Schuyler each of those times. And so that relationship between Hamilton and Philip Schuyler grew after Hamilton became Schuyler's son-in-law. It intensified further with the end of the war when Clinton saw Congress adopting policies contrary to the interests of New York. This deal dealt with the forts occupied by the British in northern New York. It dealt with western lands of New York. It dealt with the quotas of taxation that New York was assessed. And it dealt with Vermont, that Congress was not assisting New York in regaining control over Vermont. And consequently, New York and Clinton's policies became contrary to the policies of those in Congress, including what Hamilton wanted to do. Hamilton was veering toward becoming a nationalist, getting more and more power for the central government, whereas Clinton was becoming more and more fearful of that central government and the policies that he viewed as contrary to New York. Clinton's policies within New York, domestic policies, proved to be quite successful. And when other states were suffering in the mid-1780s with an economic depression, New York was coming out of that depression and being quite successful. So much so that Clinton ran uncontested for governor in 1786. And so Hamilton and Clinton, their policies diverged after 1780, particularly after the Rutgers versus Waddington case, in which Hamilton supported the loyalist position. And he did that so in many other cases. And Clinton was more supportive of the patriot position and anti-loyalist. And that comes to the fore in mid-July of 1787, when Hamilton comes back from the Constitutional Convention and writes an anonymous letter that's published in the newspaper criticizing Governor Clinton for his opposition to what's happening in Philadelphia. And so what had been sort of an undercurrent opposition of the two men, Hamilton and Clinton, came out in the open in July and August of 1787.
That evolution of that relationship and of both Clinton and Hamilton is a fascinating area. Now, there's one specific thing that I was found kind of interesting is the national tariff, or the duty on imported goods. Under the Articles of Confederation, every state had to say yes, or an act wouldn't pass. Clinton voted yes and said yes for the tariff in 1781. But then 2 years later, when it comes back up for a vote, he says no. Is that sort of part of that evolution of the sort of putting New York's interests ahead of the nation's interests?
Let me take a quick stab at some of the background to give some flavor for everybody about this relationship where Clinton becomes an adversary for Hamilton, a bitter adversary for purposes of Hamilton being a Federalist, an ardent nationalist, and Yates and Lansing, who were the co-delegates in Philadelphia, and the New York Governor Clinton being arch anti-Federalists. So the flavor I want to give is that for Yates, he considered the Constitution with three branches of government to be a triple-headed monster, and I'm quoting, as deep and wicked a conspiracy as ever was invented in the darkest ages against the liberties of free people. And once you start giving taxing authority to this Congress, and interestingly, King Kong was what he called Congress. We had fought the Revolutionary War against a tyrannical, overreaching governmental authority that can tax you to death. So that's what he was concerned about, having a Congress that would, impair our rights as free citizens who had fought this war. So a big battle emerges, and this begins in 1781. And this was your point earlier. The Congress, they try to amend. This is when Madison is in Congress. They try to amend the Articles of Confederation to create independent taxing authority for Congress. That fails. That's the impost is what it's called. And people can go on Statutes and Stories and you can read about this. So that was the impost of 1781. And Rhode Island is the one state, the one holdout state. Some people call them Rogue Island, not Rhode Island. So Rhode Island says no, and the impost of 1781 does not get adopted. It fails in 1782. So they try again. And Hamilton is in Congress now in 1783, and he's there with Madison, and they try again with a second impost. This is an impost, by the way, is a tariff. It's a tax, and it makes sense to have the federal government because you have access to the ports to impose this tax on imports. So this is the impost of 1783 is proposed, and lo and behold, all the states agree to the impost of 1783 except for, so Rhode Island agrees. They change their view, except for New York. So New York and Clinton, who previously supported the impost, so New York is now the holdout state. So Hamilton will run for the New York legislature in 1787, and you don't really run for it. Professor Kaminski can talk about that. But so Hamilton will join the New York Assembly in 1787 and give a very important speech about why we need to adopt this impost tax. And things are beginning to come apart at the seams, and we could talk about Shays's rebellion and other issues. But the point here is that there is a disagreement, a strong disagreement between the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists. And at the top of the list of Federalists is Alexander Hamilton, and at the top of the lists of Anti-Federalists is George Clinton. And the last point I wanted to make, if you look at George Washington's diary on September 17th, and this is making the point that Sergio made earlier, if you look at that diary on September 17th, which is Constitution Day, what the diary says, and we'll maybe come back to this later, is we met in convention when the Constitution received the unanimous assent of 11 states and Colonel Hamilton's from New York. So it was 11 states approved and Hamilton, because he was not authorized to vote for the Constitution. So that's why Washington writes 11 states and Hamilton. And the story would have been very different, we think, had Yates arrived. And prior to the review of this document, it was not on the radar that Yates was riding that horse to try to reach Philadelphia to put the kibosh on what Hamilton was up to.
Let me make a little revision on the impost. All the states ratified the impost of 1786, even New York. In fact, Hamilton was not an arch supporter of the impost of 83 in Congress. He wanted it to be even stronger. And so he was, once it was proposed, it went out to the states for their adoption, which required unanimity. Hamilton was a supporter of the impost. New York had passed a state impost in 1784, and it derived a tremendous revenue from that state impost. Much of that revenue came from merchants who then passed along that tariff, the state tariff, to folks who bought foreign goods, folks who lived in New Jersey and Connecticut and other states, and their money was, in essence, going into the New York Treasury. And so New York was really doing very well. One reason why it was prospering toward the end of the recession that was taking place in the mid-1780s was this revenue that the state was getting from its state impost. It didn't need to levy a tax on land. But when New York adopted the federal impost in 1786, it attached restrictions. Every state attached restrictions on their adoptions of the impost. Abraham Yates, who's a member of Congress at this time, wrote a series of newspaper articles explaining the danger of this impost, federal impost. They were not against the money necessarily, they said. They were against the power of Congress to tax, the same as they were against Parliament's power to tax. They said, let Congress tell us how much money we should raise in New York, and we'll go about raising that money in the best possible way. And so that was the argument the New Yorkers put into their adoption of the impost. Congress found those restrictions unacceptable and asked for New York to reconsider the impost and pass it again without those restrictions. The New York Assembly did reconsider when it reconvened in January 1787. And in February 1787, Hamilton gave an impassioned speech explaining why New York ought to ratify the impost without the unacceptable restrictions. The Assembly voted against Hamilton and voted not to change its adoption of the impost. Madison wrote, that killed the impost. And so the country was left without that independent source of revenue for Congress. They had to look at some other way to get a taxing power for Congress, i.e. the Constitutional Convention was the new avenue for that.
I would like to add something to what Professor Kaminski just said, that throughout the time that New York was actually occupied by the British, Clinton loved the central government. But everything changed as soon as it got liberated, because now, just like Professor Kaminski was saying, New York was getting a lot of money from its own tariffs. This money was making between 20 or 30% to 50% of the whole budget that New York was getting. And the moment that this changed or was proposed to change with a federal impost, it was going to be only a 2.5% revenue that they were going to get compared to what they were getting before. So first, while he loved the central government and everything changed after New York got liberated, he had no reason to change the status quo. Clinton was doing fantastically. And not only that, but the people that were the other delegates in the New York delegation to the Constitutional Convention were Clintonites. And you can see the factions of the Federalists and the anti-Federalists here. Alexander Hamilton was a nationalist, like all the Federalists, and nationalist in the sense that an identity, a national identity, as opposed to a localist, if you will, which was the mentality that Clinton and the other Federalists had, that they distrusted completely the power of a central government, like Professor Kaminski put it out.
New York saw, in many respects, that the new enemy that the state faced no longer was the British during the war, but the new enemy in their eyes was Congress and the surrounding states. In fact, delegates to Congress wrote to George Clinton saying that we must beware of these new enemies of the state. They're pursuing policies contradictory to the good of New York.
Got it. Adam.
I'm wondering if you can skip ahead to what will be slide 10, because we've been talking about this impost. So it's the second to the last slide. So this impost, which is a tax, was very important in this time frame about what powers, there it is, what powers will Congress have? And this is an example, and people can see it's a fire damage document, and we can talk about the heroic efforts to preserve these records. This is an example. It says the Port of New York, and there was a second port also where the tax was being imposed. And this gave New York leverage and gave New York independence, which it did not want to give back to Congress in a way. So I want to, and kids really don't get a chance to study this because it's really in the weeds. And what impost? What are you talking about? This tariff tax in New York? But this was a big event. This was the reason why Hamilton decided to rejoin the New York legislature. And I want to quote from some historians, because unlike what we discussed earlier, which was that Yates was racing back to get to Philadelphia, nobody knew about that. But the impost has been studied at length. And the good news is you have the records in your files that we're going to go through and evaluate further. But I wanted to give some flavor of what other historians have said about this impost. So this is Henry Cabot Lodge, who was a US Senator and a historian. He talks about how in this speech that Professor Kaminski and Sergio mentioned, Hamilton shone with the full luster of eloquent argument, but Clinton and his followers, Governor Clinton, gave the finishing stroke to the Confederation or the Confederacy by voting down the impost. When New York says we're not going to agree to the conditions that Congress wants, that in a way was the death throes. That, and let me give you some other examples. Professor Akil Reed Amar, I think he's at Princeton or Professor Kaminski probably does. So, and he has a brand new book that just came out on other subjects. And Professor Amar points out that New York's no vote doomed the revenue plan and was for many Americans the last straw, confirming the imbecility of the Confederation and the practical impossibility of reforming the Articles from within. So what this happens here is that when New York votes down the impost in 1787, January, February of 1787, that gives momentum to the delegates in Philadelphia because, and it gives momentum for states to send delegates to Philadelphia. And perhaps one of us will talk about the dynamics of the New York Delegation on the predicament that Hamilton was in. One other quick example, and we love reading these primary sources, and we write about this on Statutes and Stories, but the speech that Hamilton gives was reported in all the papers, and when I say all, in a good number of papers, and it made its way to Paris, where Marquis de Lafayette was. And Marquis de Lafayette reads a newspaper in Paris, and we know this because he writes a letter to Hamilton, and this is what he says. This is after Hamilton's impost speech. The Marquis de Lafayette says, "Of you I hear by some of our friends and in the newspapers." And what he's talking about is the impost speech, which is a very important but overlooked event leading into the Constitutional Convention.
So I'm going to just go back to a slide here, because I want to come back to the convention in Philadelphia a little bit. I think you've done a great job of setting the stage for us. You've got these growing factions, the Federalists, the Anti-Federalists. You've got some really important actions that have been taken, which really now result, as you said, Adam, basically the death knell to the Confederacy. It was starved of revenue. So the federal government or the central government had no means of doing what it was supposed to do. So the states are sending delegates to Philadelphia to fix the problem of the central government and to figure out how to construct it and how to fund it without having it step on their toes. So this is the convention. And you've got a little box around Alexander Hamilton. Hamilton was criticized, though, for not participating in the Philadelphia Convention during July and August. He came back to Philadelphia in September, just as the convention was wrapping up its work. First, is that true? Is that an accurate statement that Hamilton sort of, I don't want to say played hooky, but didn't show up for a good chunk of the hard work of writing this new Constitution?
How much time do we have?
We have about 3 minutes.
Yeah, so Hamilton gives a very important speech on June 18th, which is the only example of a delegate speaking the entire day. So he puts all his emphasis, I would argue, in that one-day speech on June 18th. And it is true that he leaves, he's not there in July. And I'll also make the point that some historians have wondered whether or not Hamilton was in July, because there's a journal of, and we'll have to go into the details, but they refer to it as a Hamilton sighting. There was a Hamilton sighting, but did he go to the convention in July? And because we now have the New York Archives records of what day he's seeking reimbursement for, that puts to bed any suggestion that Hamilton was there for July. So he leaves at the end of June, and he gives that important speech June 18th. He returns one day in August, and then he comes back in September. And the reason he comes back in September is because we believe he had this plan about trying to conciliate all the delegates and to make sure it was unanimous. And that relates to a passion of ours, which is a documentary film that we're working on to talk about a letter that was written. And I'm sure Sergio will also be able to talk about this letter and the documentary.
Well, let's talk about the letter. And in this particular case, I want to talk about the cover letter. You've argued that it's likely that it was Hamilton and not Governor Morris who wrote the cover letter. Maybe you could explain to us a little bit, what is this cover letter that we're talking about? Because some people have no idea. And then why do you think Hamilton is actually the author of this cover letter?
Sergio, do you want to set it up?
No, go ahead.
So, and Professor Kaminski has written about this at length, and I want people to understand what Kaminski has done for the last 50 years. But a lot of people don't realize that on September 17th, in that picture that we're looking at, the delegates line up. There were 38 of them who signed the Constitution. There were 3 that day who don't sign. But it wasn't just the Constitution that was signed that day. There was also a letter. And we can have a debate about what to call the letter, but it was a letter that was approved unanimously by all of the delegations. And it was a letter that accompanied the Constitution when it traveled from Philadelphia, where they're meeting in Independence Hall, to New York, which is where Congress was meeting. And this letter is very important. Professor Kaminski writes about this, that that letter was published, and there were approximately 100 newspapers at the time, but it was published. That was breaking news. It was published because, remember, they met behind closed doors that summer from May till September. And some people knew that they were meeting, but they had the windows closed, they had the door locked, and they had a rule of secrecy. And so people knew that they were doing something, but they were supposed to be reforming or amending the Articles of Confederation. And they make the decision, which in a way was the only right decision to make as a practical matter, because Rhode Island wasn't there, and there was no way that anything was going to be adopted with all 13 states under the Articles of Confederation. So they make the decision to ditch the Articles and to replace it with this new Constitution. So this letter, which we call the cover letter, you can call it a transmittal letter, you can call it Washington's letter, and that's the point. This letter, which was published in all the newspapers, and it's very important in establishing what the Federalist message is. So our argument is that this letter sort of introduces the Constitution to the world, and it was written by a 5-member committee. And the question is, who on the committee wrote it? And historians have all presumed, and there are reasons we could debate about this, and this is one of the subjects of our documentary, that Gouverneur Morris, who was the penman, if you will, who was the principal architect of the final draft of the Constitution. So Gouverneur Morris, nobody doubts it, it's all very clear, came up with the language of the final version of the preamble. But did Gouverneur Morris also write the cover letter? And it's our premise, and Sergio can also go into great detail here, that the cover letter was an Alexander Hamilton product, or at least Hamilton played a substantial role in drafting what we call the cover letter.
The letter was signed by Washington as president of the convention, and it was addressed to the president of the Confederation Congress. And as Adam said, it accompanied the Constitution, which was sent by the convention to Congress and read in Congress on the 20th of September, and then debated in Congress on the 26th through the 28th of September. I personally believe that this cover letter was perhaps the single most important document in the ratification debate. Why was it so important? Well, every time that the Constitution was printed in the newspapers, almost 100 newspapers, in broadsides and in pamphlets, in almanacs, virtually every time the Constitution is printed, the cover letter is printed with it. And George Washington had decided not to take part in the public debate over the ratification of the Constitution. He didn't stand for election to the Virginia Ratifying Convention. But every time the Constitution was printed all over the country, there right next to it was the cover letter in which Washington signed that letter. Washington explained what the Constitutional Convention did, explained the unanimity of the convention and the amicable nature of the delegates in compromising, how no one delegate would think that the Constitution was perfect. No one state would benefit totally from the Constitution, but it was a document of compromise. And that's what was in that letter from Washington. But it was a public announcement to the American people that George Washington, the hero of the Constitution, of the Revolution, the father of his country, as Henry Knox described him, favored this Constitution. And the Federalists questioned the opponents of the Constitution, saying, if Washington and in fact Benjamin Franklin favor this Constitution, who are you to oppose it? And so that's the real substantial benefit of this cover letter. It didn't just accompany the Constitution. It was a clarion call of Washington that, hey, I favor this Constitution, and it is what will preserve the benefits of the Revolution for this country in the future.
let me tick through real quickly some of the evidence on why we think Hamilton, we may never know for sure, but why we have strong evidence that Hamilton actually wrote the letter. And another symbolic reason why the letter is so important, this cover letter, and folks can go to statutesandstories.com and read all about it, is that the letter signifies, as Professor Kaminski was saying, not only does George Washington support the Constitution, it also signifies if you're a member of the Continental Army and Washington is the commander in chief, get in line, and this is where he's directing us. It also throws his hat in that if the Constitution gets approved, Washington is agreeing effectively by signing this letter to be the next president. If you approve the Constitution, you get Washington out of retirement as the president. So let me just tick through real quickly some of the reasons why we have strong evidence that Hamilton wrote the cover letter. And this is all discussed on our website. So we refer to various words and phrases that are Hamiltonian phrases or Hamiltonian fingerprints that you see in this letter and you see in Hamilton's writing, his letters and correspondence prior to the cover letter. So that's a way of trying to make those connections, those fingerprints. Number two, the arguments in the cover letter are Hamiltonian arguments that Hamilton had been making in many cases all the way back to 1780. Third reason is that Hamilton was the indispensable right-hand man of George Washington. There's an argument, and I would defer here to Professor Kaminski and to Sergio, that Washington would have wanted Hamilton to write the letter because that's who wrote during the war the most important correspondence for Washington. Number four, the cover letter fit within Hamilton's skill set. And many historians have recognized, we could debate about Thomas Paine, we could debate about some others, that Hamilton was, in my view, the foremost pamphleteer of this time frame. And he's going to have an uphill battle for the reasons we talked about with Clinton and Lansing and Yates getting this Constitution ratified. There was also going to be a battle in Virginia and in a couple other states. And that's one of the reasons why Hamilton and Madison and John Jay write the Federalist Papers, because they know the uphill battle they're going to have in New York. So this fit within Hamilton's skill set and fit within his objective, because he knew what was going to happen once this Constitution gets approved in the other states. You have to get through New York. And lastly, and maybe Sergio can talk about Hamilton and keeping secrets.
So was Hamilton a good secret keeper, Sergio?
I was going to talk about that when we were going to be starting wrapping up, probably mentioning some of the things that Alexander Hamilton accomplished after the Constitutional Convention.
That'd be great.
And why his legacy is so important for the country. Can I get into that?
Why don't you start that now? Yes.
Okay, perfect. So Alexander Hamilton was, first of all, he was absolutely instrumental to the ratification process of the Constitution. Immediately started working with Madison and John Jay in the writing of the Federalist Papers. It was a collection of essays that urged the ratification of the United States Constitution. And to this point today, they are still considered to be the de facto interpretation of the Constitution. Alexander Hamilton also became a delegate to the New York State Ratification Convention. And at the convention, 47 anti-federalists outnumbered 19 federalists. That's how unproportional it was. You could clearly see that it was Clinton's territory. In the course of 6 weeks, actually, Hamilton spoke 26 times in support of the Constitution. He argued very well and eloquently and very passionately and logically. And eventually, the numbers started to switch. And on July 26 of 1788, New York actually became the 11th state to ratify the Constitution. Then he was proposed by Washington to become the Secretary of the Treasury. He was elected unanimously for that. And as a Secretary of the Treasury, he established the nation's economic and fiscal infrastructure. He created and oversaw the development of the U.S. Mint, U.S. Customs, what is now known as the U.S. Coast Guard. The Attorney General asked him to argue the case instead of himself, especially since it was a law that Hamilton had proposed during the tenure of the Secretary of the Treasury. And we're talking about the carriage tax. Hilton argued that the tax on the carriages were something that was constitutional. And Hamilton actually argued in favor of this. He argued that the law was constitutional. This was accepted and the constitutionality of this law was upheld. And this is not well known so much. There is, this was the first test of the constitutionality of a law. The only reason why the later Marbury versus Madison is more well known is because it was the first time a law was determined unconstitutional and not constitutional. But Hamilton was the first one to argue for the constitutionality of a law. And there were many, many other things. And going back to what Adam was saying about Hamilton keeping secrets, one of the important accomplishments, if you want to call it that way, that Hamilton did following the Constitutional Convention was drafting the farewell address of George Washington when he left public service 20 years after starting in 1796. Washington presented this address that was sacred, pretty much, to everybody. So the whole notion of having anybody else being the one to draft that thing was outrageous, and people had to protect that at all costs. Actually, Eliza Hamilton, Hamilton's widow, she worked tirelessly to prove that it was Hamilton who actually drafted the the farewell address, and the actual document was in the power of Rufus King, who refused to give it to her because that would destabilize the perception and pretty much, you know, it would be like breaking something that was absolutely sacred. She eventually was able to get a copy and to prove that Hamilton was indeed the one who did that. And the point of this all is that it's no surprise at all, because when Hamilton was looking for an aide, when Washington was looking for an aide during the Revolutionary War, he wrote that he needed someone who could not only write for him, but think for him. And so you could see that Hamilton was thinking and writing for him before the Constitutional Convention, if he was indeed the author of the letter that was supposedly signed by George Washington when presented to Congress during the Constitutional Convention, and even later with the draft of the farewell address, you can see that Hamilton was still having that role. And the fact that he never spoke to anybody or made it public or kept it a secret, because he also understood how, you know, the sacredness of keeping that perception of Washington, that goes back to how it's not, you know, it makes sense to think that probably Hamilton had more than a hand in creating the cover letter of the Constitution.
Hamilton certainly worked in the world of secrecy. He was an intriguer to a great extent, and worked politically in that kind of context. But by the same token, Hamilton took the initiative, and he was not averse to coming out publicly and making a stand, and in fact, being the initiator. Napoleon was often quoted at the time saying the tools of war belong to those willing to use them. I would expand upon that, saying that the tools of war belong to those willing and able to use them. Hamilton was also a believer in that kind of thing. And he thought that in both war and in politics, it was important to take the initiative. The advantage went to the initiator. And instead of the politics of George Clinton was laying back and waiting for the opportune time, Hamilton didn't hesitate on various occasions, and he took the opportunity to act publicly.
I want to bring Josie back in a second we can start to talk about a few questions. And again, they're starting to pile up, but there are a lot of great resources available. And Adam has mentioned statutes and stories a number of times. It's a great web resource. We really encourage folks to learn more about that website. The Alexander Hamilton Awareness Society is another incredibly important resource. The Center for the Study of the American Constitution. All of this is incredibly important to all of us, understanding how our republic was created and how it has continued to thrive for these 240 years. So we are really grateful that you all are helping us get a deeper, richer knowledge of not just Alexander Hamilton, but all the things that he created or had a hand in creating. So thank you very much for that. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen and bring it up to Josie.
Thank you very much. And I second Tom's remarks about thanking you for sharing all this fascinating information with us. And Adam, you spoke very eloquently about the importance of following the money, and many of our listeners are following the money and have some questions related to that. So the first one is, what are we talking about when we're talking about 121 pounds?
By the way, the individual who asked that question in the chat is himself an esteemed, and I encourage people to look at Michael Newton's website and the wonderful work he has done. But I'm going to kick the question over to Professor Kaminski, because Professor Kaminski has lived this material, and there are all kinds of good questions, and some of them I don't know the answers to yet. We're trying to figure out. But I would defer to Michael Newton and Professor Kaminski, and keep in mind that the different states had many of them in different currencies, and the U.S. did not. And this is the way I'll answer it. The U.S. did not yet have our own official currency, and it would be, to Sergio's point, Alexander Hamilton as the Secretary of Treasury that would create the new federal mint in the 1792 timeframe. So when you try to compare the values, and that's one of the questions a lot of people want to know, what can you buy with the 40 shillings in Delaware, or the 32 New York shillings, which is what they were reimbursed every day. So I would defer to my colleagues who have more expertise on the numbers than I do.
The delegates to the convention, as is often the case with state legislatures and under the Constitution, the U.S. representatives and senators were paid a per diem. They were not paid a salary. Salaries were frowned upon at the time. The government shouldn't pay people for not working, but they should pay them for when they did work. And so there was a per diem that was decided upon, and also a travel allowance. So that was what was provided for in these documents that are in the archives. As far as the per diem, 32 shillings a day, that was a substantial amount of money for the average American at the time. I would say it compensated men who were professionals, such as Hamilton as a lawyer here. And so it was probably in terms of New York paper money, which was adopted and issued in 1786. And it passed with a fairly minimal depreciation. And so I would say it's hard to give an exact number here as to what the value is. But I wouldn't be surprised if in today's currency, 32 shillings a day might be the equivalent of several $100s a day. So it was a substantial amount of money in it. And if paid, it would more than meet the expenses that these delegates were incurring, and also taking them away from their jobs where they were making an income.
I'm going to make the point because I know there are some homeschoolers looking at some of the slides, but some of you might say, well, it's 121 pounds that Hamilton gets reimbursed and it's 32 shillings a day. How do you come up with that answer? And what you have to do is you have to take the 32 shillings per day times 76 days, you multiply them together, and then you divide by 20 because the ratio between shillings to pounds was 20-1. So that's how you come up with, and it's right there in the slides that we have, the 121 pounds that Hamilton was paid. And I'm thinking Sergio can also answer a related question, which is why was it important that Hamilton was paid? Forget about what the dollar amount was, because that's really trivia, right? But there is independent legal significance, we think, to why they did get paid and what that means. And I'm just wondering, Sergio, if you want to talk real quick about that?
Yeah, first, I just wanted to make sure that it was New York pounds, actually. It's interesting what you mentioned, because as you mentioned earlier, Brodius Mitchell actually wrote that there was no knowledge, or we may never know if they got actually paid. But here's the thing. In order for the delegation to actually be a delegation, it had to have a minimum of 2 members at all times. And one of the things that wasn't mentioned before, but it's important to mention now, is that Hamilton did not want a 3-people delegation. He actually wanted a 5-people delegation. He wanted Jay to be part of it. That obviously didn't happen, and he was stuck with 2 people who were anti-federalists. They did not share the same mindset or the idea of having that national identity that Hamilton was pushing for. Every vote that was given at the Constitutional Convention was given as a delegation, not as individuals. So Hamilton was voted down every single time because he was, just like Chernow said, he was relegated to a minority in an opposing delegation. it came the time in which Hamilton left. A lot of historians agree that it was out of frustration of being voted down every single time. Also probably to do with the perception of being perceived of someone who was not being successful, even though the reality was completely different because everybody knew about his reputation and what he stood for. He also did the resolution for the Annapolis Convention, etc. But there were other reasons too. He needed to go back and make some money. He was also working with the Manumission Society throughout those times and then came back. But after Hamilton left, Yates and Lansing also left. And with their departure, the delegation from New York was done. It was no longer a delegation. However, you see that later Hamilton returns, he comes back, but Yates and Lansing do not. Now, remember that I said that you needed a minimum of 2 people for it to be called a delegation. That's the reason why you see Hamilton participating in debates and participating in things, but he's not allowed to vote because he's no longer in a delegation. So here comes the question. When you see that George Washington writes that the Constitution was unanimously upheld by all these states and Colonel Washington from New York, was Hamilton at all acting with the legal representation of the state of New York? Was he simply acting as an individual? Was any of the things that he did, particularly because he was elected and that is a big word, he was elected to the Committee of Style and Arrangement, which was the most important one, providing the final draft of the Constitution, the 2 resolutions for ratification, and the cover letter of the Constitution. But was there any legal validity to him actually participating in all this if he was not acting on behalf of New York and he was simply acting as an individual? And one way to answer that question that we could have about that was finding the records of reimbursement, because that would prove that he was actually paid by the state of New York, and therefore everything he did was sanctioned and valid by the state of New York. And that is the significance, one of the many significance of why these records of reimbursement are so important, because we have the records of reimbursement of Alexander Hamilton, of Yates and Lansing, and 1 year after, proving that indeed, counting the days in which Alexander Hamilton came back, and therefore what he did was reimbursed by the state of New York, and that answers itself.
So a lot of the people who have been listening want to sort of talk about this matter of the cover letter, and I'd like to focus some of the questions on that before we have to end for today, because it is so important. You've convinced me. So one of the questions is, first of all, if I'm understanding correctly, it was George Washington who signed that cover letter, and he was the only person who signed that cover letter. And why was that? Why was that important? Why was it important to have George Washington sign that cover letter, and why is that such a big deal?
It's a common thing to have a cover letter. When documents go out from a body, when the Articles of Confederation went out from Congress, there's a cover letter that goes with it. Madison wrote a letter on the 8th of April, 1787, to Edmund Randolph, the governor of Virginia, and said there should be a cover letter to the explaining what this new Constitution is going to be about. And so there was a seeming necessity for the letter. It could have been unsigned. It could have just been from the convention. But usually the presiding officer is the person who signs such a cover letter. The president of Congress signed the cover letter for the articles. But so Washington would qualify in that regard. But more importantly, everyone understood the significance of Washington and how important he was. They didn't realize at the time, in September 1787, that Washington would not participate in the ratification debate publicly. But as Hamilton and others indicated to Washington, the fact that you came to the convention and you was the president of the convention was a de facto statement that you will be the first president of the United States. And Washington understood that, didn't particularly want to be the first president, but because of that, he felt it would be unseemly for him to advocate the adoption of the Constitution, because it might be viewed that he favored it because of his own position. And so the cover letter becomes the public announcement that Washington favors the Constitution. And that's a very important public statement to make. It convinced a lot of people that Washington was not out to feather his own nest. Washington had total power in 1783, and he turned his back on it. And so you should trust Washington in this regard because he endorses this Constitution.
I see that Tom has pulled up the letter here so that we can see George, and this has obviously been printed somewhere, and George Washington has signed it. Adam, you had a follow-up point to make there?
It is our premise that if we had, and we've got, there's no shortage of the number of copies of the cover letter we have because it was printed in all the newspapers, and that's what's called a broadside. So it's not a newspaper, it's a single sheet of the Constitution, and the cover letter you'll notice is on top. So the point is that we think that if we had the signed copy, and it's been lost to history, we do not have, and that's one of the things we're exploring in our documentary. But if we had the signed copy with Washington's signature on it, we think that document deserves to be in the National Archives. It's that important, alongside the Declaration and the Constitution and the Bill of Rights. I'll also make the observation about cover letters that the Declaration of Independence was sent to the different state governors and the state legislature. So there were probably 13 cover letters. The latest I saw is that we only have about 7 of them because it was sent to each of the different states. But we don't have the signed cover letter. But we think the cover letter is not just important symbolically and politically, but also today it has a message. And I'll just mention, and I encourage people, go to Statutes and Stories and go to Professor Kaminski's website and read about the cover letter, because some people would say the spirit of amity means friendship, the spirit of amity and mutual deference and concession, which is what the cover letter talks about, that what brought together these delegates, they struggled during that summer, that compassion and that working together, that comity, some would say, has been lost, and we need to re-examine and appreciate what they accomplished. By no means was the Constitution perfect, but what they were able to accomplish that summer is phenomenal. And I think we can all agree the US Constitution, the longest living Constitution in the history of the world, we should all be grateful for it. So that is part of our mission, is to rediscover this forgotten cover letter.
You see how important Washington was, and what the printer does to his name, puts it way up front here and in big capital letters, George Washington. He didn't have to do that. It could have been just left to the bottom of the letter. As you can see, Washington's name is at the bottom also. When Congress sends the Constitution to all the states on the 28th of September, 1787, it authorizes the publication of the Constitution as a 4-page broadside. And that was sent to all the state governors and given to all the state conventions. In that 4-page broadside, you have the Constitution, you have the resolution of Congress sending the Constitution to the states, but you also have Washington's cover letter in that 4-page broadside. And so every single state ratifying convention is given that statement by Washington. And not only is that letter printed in all these newspapers, broadsides, and pamphlets throughout the country, but it's quoted in many other letters and many newspaper articles. The phrase that Adam referred to about amity and deference, that sentence is quoted, I wouldn't be surprised, at least 100 times through in newspaper articles all over the country. So this is a major political tool that the Federalists have. As I said before, if Washington favors the Constitution, who are you to oppose it?
So I think that's where we're going to have to end it today. There's so much more to talk about, I know. I do want to say, I have to make a nod to one of the questions that we had. How were these documents discovered in the archives? How did you know where to look? What was the process of searching for them? These are the kinds of documents that are in archives. And they're not necessarily labeled under Hamilton, but if you're interested in a subject, talk to your archivist, talk to the people working in these repositories. They will have ideas about record collections you can look through. In Adam's case, you can read a lot about how these records were found on his website, statutesandstories.com. He talks a lot about that. A lot of it is just tenacity, which Adam, you have a lot of. And these records are out there, and they are in archives both at the state and local levels. And I would encourage you all to, get looking. And in the meantime, I want to thank everybody for this insightful presentation today, and to everyone who joined us to listen to it. And it is our privilege to make these events available to you and to keep New York State's history alive. If you're interested in the content we create and would like more of it, please contact us at aptrust@nysed.gov to receive a free past issue of New York Archives magazine. And you can visit our website, www.nysarchivestrust.org, to learn more. Thank you so much, everyone.